Welcome to Tech Right Now, the weekly podcast of the American Conservative. I'm Andrew Day, here with my colleagues Joseph Addington and Harrison Berger. It's Monday, a little after 10 a.m. here in D.C., and today we'll discuss a deadly ICE shooting in Minneapolis last week, the ongoing protests in Iran, and whether President Donald Trump will again authorize strikes on Iran, and Trump's stated intention to take over Greenland and the implications of that stated intention and possible act for the international order, international law, etc. Although that discussion is probably going to be pretty brief because we have an unrelenting domestic and global news cycle and a lot of things to talk about before that. After this conversation, in the back half of this episode, we'll hear an interview with William Hartung of the Quincy Institute that Harry conducted. Harry, what's that interview about?
Yeah, so he and Ben Freeman of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, they just published a really excellent book that we reviewed at the American Conservative called "The $1 Trillion War Machine," and he basically breaks down all the waste, fraud, and abuse that Pentagon contractors are committing annually to the tune of tens of billions of dollars, often added up over the decades, many trillions. So it's a very important book that's just come out. It's rigorous research. Unlike I'd say many other books that have come out on the subject, it's very easy to digest if you don't really know too much about the military-industrial complex. So I hope you all enjoy the interview.
Yeah, and that book's going to need an update because President Trump is now talking about a $1.5 trillion military budget that he's going to push for 2027. I mean, he obviously doesn't have like unilateral authority to do that, but I guess he wants Congress to pass that, very significant increase to the Pentagon budget. But let's go ahead and discuss this ICE shooting. Obviously, it stirred a lot of controversy and passions in the public. Last Wednesday, an ICE immigration agent shot and killed 37-year-old Renee Good in her car in Minneapolis. Videos of the encounter from multiple angles quickly made their way to social media. The reaction was polarized, with most conservatives saying the killing was justified because the agent was in fear of his life, because Renee Good was trying to run him over with her vehicle, while liberals saw a masked agent of the state shooting a U.S. citizen in her face for no good reason as she kind of fled in panic out of fear for her life. And although it's mostly polarized, it's not entirely polarized. There are some conservatives and liberals taking the opposite view of their tribe. The federal government quickly came to the defense of the ICE agent. Donald Trump said on social media that the video was a horrible thing to watch, but that the woman driving, this is a quote, the woman driving the car was very disorderly, obstructing and resisting, who then violently, willfully, and viciously ran over the ICE officer. I think we can all agree that that's a significant exaggeration. Vice President J.D. Vance has taken a leading role in defending the ICE agent and blasting the media for prejudging him. Vance said the woman who was shot had been brainwashed by left wing ideology. He called the event a tragedy, but said it was a tragedy of her own making. Homeland Security Director Kristi Noem said the woman had committed an act of domestic terrorism. State and local, and indeed federal leaders from Minnesota have denied those characterizations. They say they are skeptical that the FBI investigation in this case will be fair and impartial. There are some complicated jurisdictional issues. I mean, this is going to be like a murder case, so that's Minnesota state law, but it's a federal official. I think it's going to be tried in D.C. I mean, we'll keep an eye on that. Joseph and Harry, you two seem to see this episode differently from one another, so maybe we can have a constructive debate, which is kind of unusual. I think most of the podcasts covering this, all of the hosts like see things the same way. Joseph, you take a more law and order view, I would say. Harry, a more civil libertarian one. Both of those general views have, connections to the right, to paleoconservatism. Um, so you can both fill in the details that I left out as needed. I didn't want to describe this event in too much detail because people kind of disagreed. There's a lot of ambiguities about exactly what happened, even though we have multiple camera angles to look at. But Joseph, why don't you go first and give us the kind of pro law and order view, if that's still the position you want to take?
Sure. Um, so I think the basic thing that you have to start out with is, first of all, uh, it is obviously, a tragedy that this woman was killed. Um, but the simple fact of the matter is that this is this martyrdom, if you want to call it that, was an intentional creation of the sort of left-wing protest movements. This is exactly what they want to happen when they go through and they organize and they train all of these their legal observers, and they attempt to uh, do things like surround ICE cops, box them in with vehicles, and prevent federal law enforcement from carrying out its basic immigration enforcement duties. Um, these organizers are perfectly happy for to see one of their protesters essentially get killed, as horrible as that is, because it's a way to escalate. It's a way to make a martyr. It's a way to turn the news cycle, and it's a way to make it much more difficult for federal law enforcement to do their jobs. And so one of the important things is that we can't allow these kinds of uh, feathering the edges, as it were, of use of force engagements to prevent law enforcement from being able to do its job. That's kind of what I would want to say as the base case. These kinds of unfortunate confrontations are the result of a deliberate left-wing campaign in an attempt to make fulfilling basic functions of law enforcement impossible by essentially putting civilians up and pressing as far against the edge as they can of things like uses of force. Um,
Can you just say, just at least quickly, what do you think about the shooting itself? Like, the use of force, do you see it as justified? Do you think the officer is
yes,
legally
yes, yes. I was
culpable?
just setting the stage. I'm moving
Okay.
on to that right now.
Mhm.
As far as the question of was the use of force by the officer for Renee Good in specific justified? I think it was. I think first of all, people have to realize that one of the major tasks of law enforcement is they have to be able to make snap decisions about what's going to happen and whether their lives are in danger in about half a second. One of the things that commentators often don't realize is, we have the luxury of we can watch all these different camera angles, slow down to try to determine exactly what was happening. That's not a luxury law enforcement has. Um, so they have to be able to make very quick decisions about whether the life is in danger or not. I don't necessarily think the ICE agent made a good judgment, but I think his judgment was perfectly defensible. Um, as far as the facts of the matter are, uh, the ICE agent was we thankfully we know because we have the video now from the ICE agent's cell phone that he was filming. So what he did was he was walking around the car as Renee was parked crosswise against across the street in an attempt to sort of prevent ICE vehicles from proceeding and from doing their immigration raids, as it were. He so the ICE officer was walking around the car with other agents. They ordered her to get out of the way. She was, along with her lesbian wife, uh, essentially taunting the ICE officers. Eventually, the officer went around the hood and slightly past it, and one of the other officers walked up to the car, ordered Renee to get out of the car, to turn it off, and to exit the vehicle, and then began to attempt to open the car doors. At that point, Renee backed the car up, which put the ICE agent in front of the hood and pressed on the gas. Now she was turning to the right as this was happening. Um, but when she pressed on the gas, if you look at the vehicle, the the car was still pointing towards, and she accelerated forwards, and she hit the ICE agent with a corner of her hood. Um, and at that point, he'd drawn his weapon and he shot her through the window. Uh, now the difficulty, of course, is whether this was a use of deadly force, whether the ICE agent thought his life was in danger. I think it's perfectly reasonable that it very well was in danger, um, simply because a car is a deadly weapon. It's thousands of pounds of metal, and it can accelerate very quickly. And it doesn't even need to be going particularly fast in order to do significant harm if it knocks you down and goes over you. So the ICE officer had to make a very quick decision at that point. He saw a car accelerating towards him. Uh, People have said that Renee Good was panicked. She was not. We see her relatively calm, make eye contact with him, right as she is driving in the vehicle in the video that we see from the ICE officer's perspective that he had on his gear. Um, and so, and of course, he's not able to very easily see the tires at that point. So all he sees is a car that is accelerating towards him, and that could very well knock him down and drive over him. And so at that point, I think the shooting was unfortunate. I don't know that that's necessarily a decision I would have made, but I think it's perfectly defensible as an officer. If you see that you are in danger of being run over by a car, that you have the that it's a defensible decision to shoot the person and thereby attempt to save your life.
Okay. Harry, what's your view? How do you see it differently?
I mean, I actually don't disagree necessarily with everything that Joseph said, and I could walk through some of the points that I agree with and where we differ a little bit. Um, to the point, I could start with this because you said that this car that Renee Good was driving, it is a deadly weapon, and I agree. Car accidents kill many people every year. It's one of the top causes of death in the United States. I guess my question is, why was this ICE officer walking directly in front of it? Because I mean, I've been pulled over many times. Or I shouldn't say many times, but I've been pulled over. And especially when my car is on, I've never had a law enforcement official walk directly in front of it. It just doesn't really happen. They walk to the side for a specific reason, because, of course, people flee from scenes, they flee from the cops all the time. The thing to consider here is that these are not even cops. This is ICE and ICE. So this law enforcement is supposed to be for illegal immigrants or just immigrants in general, if you want to broaden that scope. But they're not really supposed to be interacting too much with, American citizens at all. And if they do, and especially if they use deadly force against American citizens, they should really have a good reason for doing it. I think that you can debate what the video shows. It has kind of become that, red dress or gold dress meme from like 5 years ago, where people see very different things. To me, the most revealing part is not what happened necessarily in those 5 or 10 seconds during the shooting, but what happened directly before it. Which, I mean, you mentioned the facts of this case. I think you did leave one thing out, although I agree with most of how you described it. The one important piece is that Renee Good was waving a car on, looking like she was about to turn left and kind of get out of there in the first place before these ICE officers in their truck, came up to her and then started kind of screaming at her, saying, get the F out of the car, kind of mobbing her car in a way that was not professional, was kind of meant to escalate uh, that situation. So I think I don't necessarily agree that this was a case of they had to do it. I think it was a case of they could. And so I see this again from a civil libertarian perspective, not just about the event that happened that day with the shooting, but part of a longer trajectory that has been going on in the United States, in which our police departments have been increasingly militarized. At first, to fight the war on drugs during the 1980s, this all happened during the Reagan administration, but then also under in the 1990s under Bill Clinton to take down the Patriot movement and all that, especially in the wake of the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995, and then escalating too with the war on terror, where we now have police on our street who basically use armored vehicles, have all sorts of weapons that are usually only available to soldiers in, overseas in Iraq. So I think that that's part of what this was. Uh, kind of the wars abroad, coming home, being deployed. In this case against American citizens, and it's not the first time either.
I mean,
Joseph,
first of all, as far
Joseph, if
as
I
the
could, can I wanna just say something, and then I'm gonna give you the last word, just because I think, probably on most things that you 2 disagree about, I would agree more with Joseph than with Harry. I think on this occasion, I'm more with Harry, although perhaps for different reasons, like, I'm a little less concerned about this, like, war on terror boomerang thing that you just mentioned, Harry. But maybe if I could say a couple things, and then Joseph, we could get your response as the last word. I think you were right, Joseph, to distinguish between the narrow question of like the officer's legal culpability and this broader list of like more comprehensive factors dealing with uh, left-wing protests since like 2014, especially in the year 2020. Like that's a context for this. And I would say, one part of this conversation that hasn't escaped my attention is it does seem like these ICE agents are kind of poorly trained, like when it comes to like de-escalation, right? I've seen lots of videos where they appear to be acting unprofessionally. There's been instances where they have apprehended U.S. citizens. I mean, I don't think the apprehension lasts for a long time. They usually realize their mistake and then let them go. But there's definitely been some false positives in that sense. So people are on edge, understandably, right? And this is the thing that I would really emphasize here. I mean, there are some complexities, like, people on the left were saying that Renee Good was at one point they were saying she had just dropped her kid from school and she's like executing a 3-point turn or something. Then they were saying she was a monitor of these ICE raids. It's pretty clear to me if you look at the videos that show like the minutes leading up to this encounter that she was being disruptive, right? Like that's true. I don't know exactly what the nature of her disruption was or what the ICE raid was on this street, but she's parked perpendicular on the street, and she's like taunting the officers, although she has a somewhat kinder disposition than her wife does. Um, so that's true, but at the same time, these ICE officers, they totally unnecessarily escalated the situation. Like they didn't say, "Ma'am, can you please step out of the vehicle?" They said, "Get the F out of the car." They're not dressed like they're not uniformed the way that police officers typically are. They're wearing masks, at least some of them in the video. Um, and I can imagine she doesn't look terrified, but I do think that there was some kind of panic response. um, at one point, we were hearing that she was getting contradictory orders. I think that that's not true. It seems like she was getting one order from the ICE agents, which was get out of the vehicle, but her wife was yelling at her to drive, um, which was a mistake, and she shouldn't have done that. But on this question of the shooting officer, I mean, the reason he's in front of the car is because he's going around the car, and her backing up is what kind of situates him directly or almost directly in front of the hood. Although he maybe could have handled that better, like his positioning. But like my question is, why shoot? Like, okay, the car is coming at you. You made a correct distinction, Joseph, that she's turning the steering wheel to the right, but the wheels themselves, at the moment she accelerates in the direction of the hood, are actually pointed at him. Um, I don't know if it's verified that that car bumped him. I don't know if it made contact. I actually think it didn't make contact with him, but it was close. Okay, but why not just step away? Like, why shoot through the windshield once and then twice through the window, the open window as it drives by? Because it seems like the rules of engagement for DHS, under which ICE is, uh, managed, is that you can't shoot a person in a car that's moving unless there is a danger to others and there's no way to evade that danger absent, lethal force. Why not just step to the side? He, in fact, did step to the side. When he fires the first shot, he's not any longer in front of the vehicle, right? If he didn't fire the shot, he wouldn't have gotten hit by the vehicle. But I'll give you the last word, Joseph, as promised.
Sure. Uh, few things that I want to respond to. First is, yeah, the ICE officer wasn't in front of the vehicle. At first, he was off to the side. When she backed up, that puts him in front of the vehicle, which is again another sort of point towards to the officer as far as the question of reasonable doubt of, is this going to be a deadly violent situation? I wasn't in front of the vehicle. She backs up, puts me in front of the vehicle, and then begins accelerating towards me. So then the question is, uh, well, the question of why shoot. First of all, again, the officer was able to sidestep some. It seems I from the videos that I saw, I'm pretty sure that he got hit. Uh, it very much looks like it, although I mean, we can't tell for certain. But it looked pretty obvious to me that he was hit, and moved out of the way, afterwards. So I mean, from that perspective, either he was hit or he was very close to being hit. So close that nobody can actually agree on whether he was hit or not. Um, so at that point, if she had been intentionally trying to run him over, it could have been significantly more dangerous. But he didn't know that she would keep turning to the right. If she was intentionally trying to run him over, it could have been significantly worse. And so that's, again, a judgment that you can't make in advance. He had a very, very short period of time between the acceleration and when he had to decide whether to shoot and when he was hit or not. And if it was reasonable for him to think that he may be in danger of serious bodily harm or death, then he was justified in taking the shot. As far as taking multiple shots, you're trained, you know, once you start shooting, you keep shooting. That's just a matter of training. So, yes, he tried to move out of the way and he shot, but because, when you're shooting, that doesn't mean you can't sidestep. So he was trying to simultaneously extract himself from the situation and also attempting to take out the threat. So
Yeah,
I
the
I
first
I
shot is through the windshield, which suggests he's somewhat in front of the vehicle, right?
right. But
I
and
promise I'll
again,
give you the last word, but I think I'm still gonna give you the last word. Let's say we'll screw the Green Line discussion later. I kind of want to continue this. Harry, do you want to say anything else, and then we'll come back to Joseph, and maybe I'll say something too.
Um, you can go first. I'll comment a little later, actually.
well, can
Okay,
I respond to one more thing before we continue?
please, please, please.
Sure. So, as far as the question of ICE and the legality of doing things like engaging American citizens and whether this in particular was justified, I think it's important to recognize that, first of all, like, ICE, yes, is principally immigration enforcement, but they do have a lot of engagement with American citizens because American citizens are actively attempting to interfere with immigration
Sure.
enforcement. And
Mm,
so, if you are if there are a lot of people intentionally obstructing ICE's duties, like American citizens don't have the infinite right to obstruct any of ICE's activities and suffer no consequences because ICE is a law enforcement agency that's meant for dealing with immigration. If you instruct federal law enforcement, then yes, like ICE doesn't have to say, "Oh, sorry, we can't touch you. You're not illegal immigrants." They can detain you for attempting to interfere with federal law enforcement, and like that's a necessary function. They're not going to go through and call the Minneapolis Police Department to come and arrest these protesters. The FBI can't be along to arrest anybody who attempts to interfere with ICE immigration raids anywhere they go. There's not the personnel for that. A necessary function of any law enforcement is the ability to detain and stop people who are attempting to prevent you from enforcing the law. And that is going on at mass scale.
Yeah, I mean, I think the problem here is obviously uh, as Andrew said, the ICE agents came up, they're masked, they're not really identified like regular law enforcement. And I don't think really Americans like Renee Good are necessarily used to that. And so when you're being surrounded, like she was, I mean, from all sides by ICE officers who, again, do not identify themselves. I imagine that can be very scary. And yes, her wife was yelling at her to go and to flee.
I
I
mean, there
think
was
that
no question that she knew that these were federal law enforcement officers. She was talking with them
right,
earlier.
but
She
you're
came
allowed to
out
flee,
specifically to
right?
block
But
them.
you're allowed to flee from law enforcement, and fleeing from law
You are not
enforcement doesn't
allowed to
mean that
flee
you.
from law enforcement after they give you an order like,
What
"Get
I
out
mean
of the
is
car, we are
it doesn't
arresting
mean that
you."
you it doesn't mean that you get shot. People flee from law enforcement all the time and don't get shot.
Do we
Um,
actually know
No,
are
but they
if an
don't.
ICE agent can an ICE agent arrest you? Like, are there
Yes,
any
they can arrest
differences?
and detain you if you're attempting to interfere
But
with them.
are there any differences from a normal police officer in this regard? Obviously, I think that she surely broke the law by fleeing it,
no,
by
that's not
rigging.
what I mean by allowed. I mean that it
But
doesn't
but
mean
but
that
but
you
no,
get
but
shot
is
for.
there, Joseph, do you know, like, ICE agents versus police officers? Do you know if there are any differences in their ability to arrest and detain you? Is that the same?
I am pretty sure that it's the same, but I'm not a legal expert on this matter.
Okay. I was just curious, but go ahead, Harry, sorry.
And anyways, it's not that officers have a carte blanche right to shoot anybody who's attempting to flee. Obviously, that's very much not the case. The question is, in attempting to flee, did she put the officer in a situation where he was in fear,
No,
reasonably
well,
in
he
fear
had
for
no
his
other
life?
choice. It's if he had no other choice, and he did. As you said in your response, he was stepping away as he was shooting. And this is the problem, like, there's plenty of videos online that I've seen, and Wall Street Journal just did a giant video investigation on this. So this is not the first time that these ICE agents are using deadly force, not as a last resort, but really just reflexively. I mean, there's a video I saw of just a woman protesting and this ICE agent who we have to remember, these are people who are being recruited with thousands of dollars of bonus incentives because they can't really find people to do these jobs. No one wants to do them, and so they're taking anyone who they can get. You know, they're not the cream of the crop necessarily. And so these people, for instance, at this protest, there was this one ICE agent who this young woman came up to her, came up to him shouting in the ICE officer's face. And sure, like that's not nice, but he pulled a gun on her and just put it in her face. And it's reflexive for a lot of these ICE agents. And I think that's what happened here, where he had his gun drawn. Um, that's not something that cops necessarily do. Uh,
I should
at the
note he did not have his gun drawn for almost all of the encounter. It wasn't until after she started backing up that he
right, but
began to put
you don't
away
draw
his
your
fear.
gun because
He
someone's
actually
reversing their car.
drew and fired
But that's
extremely quickly in the situation.
right, but
Yeah, I think
you
I
don't
think she
draw
might
your
be
gun.
accelerating by the time he
Her foot was already
draws
on
his
the accelerator when he
firearm.
drew his weepon and fired. It
But
happened
it's
in an
very
extremely
close,
You
but
short
have
I
to
period
think
of
go
time.
that's
back and
true.
look at the yeah, you'd have to go back and look at the video, and this is what I mean by blue dress, white dress. Like, he has the phone apparently in one hand and the gun in the other, and I'm sure you could timestamp it and find the exact moment, just like you could find the exact moment that that the bullets went through, the windshield, but that gun should not have been drawn in the first place in that situation, and the fact that they came up, surrounded the vehicle, yelling at her, just completely escalated the situation. It doesn't
See,
necessarily
but if
happen in
you're
routine
obstructing
traffic
federal
stops.
law
That's the
enforcement, an arrest is necessarily an escalation. Like, police officers and law enforcement don't have some kind of necessary requirement to de-escalate every situation. No, if you are arresting someone, you are naturally escalating the situation. It is your job to escalate the situation. Like,
Yeah.
you are going to use force to bring a person in. Like, that is necessarily escalation. Now you want to use the least
Right, but
amount
there
of
was
force that's
but what do you think
necessary.
about yeah, okay. Honestly, on the question of legal culpability, I certainly think that a fair, reasonable, impartial jury could find this guy not guilty. I'm sure they're gonna try to get him on some kind of manslaughter charge or something, and if they find him not guilty, I'm not gonna say, "Oh, that's BS," like, it makes sense, it makes sense that we can reasonably infer that he had a rational fear for his life, right? But on the more comprehensive view, like that's not just looking at legal culpability. I do think that there are some problems here, and I noticed that a lot of people on Twitter, where this discourse now takes place, a lot of people on the right have this view of like, okay, there's going to be stuff like this that happens. If you actually want mass deportations, you're going to have the stomach for it, and it's not going to be pretty. But in this case, this wasn't a random shooting. This was someone trying to disrupt something that necessarily needs to happen, which is deportations. And I kind of agree with that. Like, I want mass deportations, and I don't want to start crying crocodile tears every time there's something that tugs at the heartstrings. But like, this is a situation where it's like a US citizen got shot in the face 3 times, right? And, like, she's not like, the thing that most annoys me about this is, like, I'm sick of being lied to by this government. Like, it's not what Trump said was comical, okay? I can actually tell that he did consider this a horrible thing to watch, and when he was talked to about he was interviewed by the New York Times and asked about this and apparently shown the video during their discussion, and it sounds to me like he's like, "Oh, yeah, like, it's a little worse than I had characterized it as being." But this Truth Social post that I was just trying to pull up, it's, like, ridiculous, he's saying that the guy is in the hospital, and it's amazing he survived the shooter, and this woman was, like, deranged disruptor. Kristi Noem said she was a domestic terrorist. Everyone is seemingly saying that she tried to run him over. Joseph, it sounds like you agree with us. Like, that's not true. There's a distinction between whether she tried to run him over and whether the officer reasonably thought that his life was in danger by being run over, right? It could be that even the officer himself didn't think she was trying to run him over, but thought she would accidentally do so. Like, um, although in that case, it's like it's becomes a little stranger to use your firearm in that situation because like the car is going to continue its forward motion after you shoot her. It makes more sense from his perspective. He actually thought she was intentionally trying to run him over, and he had to shoot her to stop that from happening.
Or you move to the side like he was doing. That's the thing. He had his gun drawn, he was shooting, but as Joseph said, moving to the side at the same time. And so it doesn't make sense why he would necessarily
But
have
again,
to do
the
both of those
officer
things.
the officer could tell that the car was accelerating, but it would have been impossible for him to know how fast the car was accelerating. He was able to step to the side, but the car's tires also spun out on the ice before catching forward before getting traction and going forward. He had no way to tell exactly how fast the car was going to accelerate. So, yeah, he was able successfully to sidestep a lot of it, but he couldn't have known that in advance.
I've never really heard necessarily of, some 37-year-old woman being shot like 3 times in the face during a traffic stop while trying to flee it, because usually cops know some sort of procedure, uh, of how to pull people over, and yes, if they have to arrest them without, sure, putting their lives, in danger like this, ICE officer did by being, whether or not it was directly in front, kind of right around or in very close proximity to this car where it couldn't really get out of the way, not to the side of it necessarily. But anyway, we've kind of debated that
Joseph,
point.
since I promised you the last word, do you want to take the last word? I want to get to Iran because there might be a war in Iran, so we should talk about it. But do you want to say anything else, Joseph?
No, I've made my case about as well as I think is necessary.
Okay, so let's talk about Iran now. Late last month, protests kicked off in Iran. Initially, those protests were led by shopkeepers in Tehran who were upset about the plummeting value of the Iranian currency, which was making it difficult to sell imported products, especially cell phones. So the protests always had this like interesting, strong symbolic element because these bizarre shopkeepers, it's called the Grand Bazaar in Tehran, that category of person was involved in the 1979 revolution in Iran. So it like had a kind of symbolic significance and suggested this might have some resonance with like bigger anti-government protests. And indeed, the protests spread, they widened in terms of their geographical scope and the expressed grievances of the demonstrators. We started to see more anti-government slogans. Reza Pahlavi, the exiled son of the deposed Shah of Iran, has been spurring the protesters on, urging them to seize cities in Iran. But until last week, the protests basically seemed in control and not so different from other protests that we've seen in Iran the past few years. But things really snowballed last week and in the last few days. And in recent days, the protests became very chaotic. The government has responded with deadly force. Human rights groups are estimating that hundreds of protesters and dozens of security forces have been killed. But it's quite hard to say because Tehran has imposed a communications blackout. So we're not getting as many videos as we normally would from Iran. Even people here in America or in the West or whatever who have family in Iran are saying that they can't really get in touch with them, especially over the past like 90 hours or so, or two couple of days. I've heard different things. President Trump had on multiple occasions threatened to attack Iran if the Islamic Republic killed demonstrators. Um, this weekend, yesterday we got reports that military options had been presented to him for strikes in Iran, but that he had not made a final decision. We also learned that Iranian and U.S. officials had been in contact this weekend on Saturday. They've been discussing the possibility of negotiations. Trump confirmed that on Air Force One last night. So this whole thing seems very unpredictable, both in terms of how big the protests currently are. We've seen some counter protests, some like pro government protests today. Lindsey Graham seems very excited and confident that the Islamic Republic is going to fall. Hawkish Republicans are saying the U.S. should strike Iran while the Islamic Republic is vulnerable to topple the regime. So that's just kind of setting the stage. And I'm just curious what you guys think in terms of what are you expecting to come next? Do you think Trump is going to strike? Are you getting vibes of like a war is coming or no? Harry, you can go first.
Well, first of all, on the protests, it's hard to know, one, how big they are, and even how big the supposed crackdown is, because obviously you have, I would say, Iranian exiles like Reza Pahlavi and his family and that network, saying that the Iranian government has killed up to 2,000 or 4,000 protesters, uh, which just
The
given
the
their
latest number is 10,000, which seems
yeah,
not true. Mhm.
obviously they have an incentive to you know exaggerate because they want to restore their old dynasty that the United States government gave Reza Pahlavi's father, you know, 70 years ago, and that's their goal. But in terms of where these protests are coming from or how big there are, it's also hard to know because the former CIA director Mike Pompeo, as well as various politicians from Israel, including in the Jerusalem Post, announced that Mossad, and by extension, of course, the CIA, who works hand in hand with them, are on the streets of Iran, fomenting at least or helping to fuel these protests bigger than they even would have been. We've seen various images of mosques on fire in Iran. It's kind of hard to think that that's coming from Iran. That seems like something that provocateurs do, especially Israelis who kind of are famous for bombing mosques. That's their thing. Um, so again, I imagine there's a lot of people taking to the streets, and I imagine that the Iranian security state is cracking down on them and killing some people. But I just don't know how big it is or what the scale is at all.
Well, I'm going by the human rights figures, and I've seen like the 200 to 500 range for protesters killed. It is interesting, there's this apparently debate on some corners of the internet about how astroturfed these protests are. I can talk about it later. I'm kind of skeptical of that. Like, we did learn during the 12-day war that that Israel, the Mossad, is like deeply penetrated into the Iranian government, right? Like that is what facilitated that whole initial surprise military operation by Israel. It's why it was pretty successful. Um, but in this case, it seems hard for them to like foment this level of protest to this extent. Like maybe they're involved, but I think there is clearly a big organic element here. I will say though, in terms of like external pressure causing this, like obviously America's intense sanctions regime against Iran is a big part of the story because like the inciting incident was the plummeting current value of the rial, the Iranian currency. I mean, just the general poor economic conditions have a lot to do with very tough American sanctions, right? And I don't know if this would be happening absent that. And also, Israel has been taking out, with America's help, Iran's proxies in the region. So the Islamic Republic is like extremely vulnerable. That's when revolutions happen. There's this political science quote from Theda Skocpol, political scientist and kind of sociologist at Harvard, that revolutions are not made, they come. Like a certain set of factors crystallize into a situation of regime collapse, and overturning. And I think that, a lot of Iran watchers that I watch, or that I listen to rather, who were earlier saying, well, these protests seem kind of similar to previous protests, and usually, it's dangerous for the regime, but the government finds a way to deal with them. A lot of them are saying, actually, this is kind of getting to potential revolution territory. That, but Joseph, what's your take on all this? Do you think a war is coming? And what do you think of Trump's like? He's in kind of a weird, delicate position in terms of whether he should intervene. How do you think he's thinking about this in terms of military action?
I mean, Trump, I'm sure, would like to intervene, but in the way that Trump likes to intervene, which is sort of a one-time strike that has low cost and risk to the United States, but that can, sort of do outsized damage. You see that Trump likes to operate this way with the raid on Venezuela to capture Maduro, with the bombing of Iran during the 12-day war. The question is that going to be sort of reasonably effective for the United States, or is that just going to create sort of an anarchistic black hole in the Middle East that we would prefer to avoid, that could foster all kinds of terrible, terrorism and things like that? Now, Iran is already a state sponsor of terror, but it's much less dangerous to the United States than something like ISIS, for example. Um, so I'm sure that Trump is attempting to find some kind of operation that would fit that purpose, but I don't know if there is one that's easily available to the US. Um, so that I assume would be the major dilemma there. Um, as far as the nature of the protests, I think it would be very difficult to astroturf something of this size. Uh, in general, sort of, provocateurs can maybe inflame or direct uh, existing protest movements, but it's very difficult to make one from scratch. The Israelis simply wouldn't have that many paid agents, uh, or operatives around. And so to the extent that people join in it is because they legitimately have grievances with the government. So something of this size is almost entirely of domestic origin, and to the extent that the Israelis are there, if they are, I have no idea whatsoever, or what they're doing. Would just be in an attempt to make it more extreme and to go to greater lengths than it would naturally. But the people and the grievances are already there, if they're being operated on at all.
Yeah, Harry.
I mean, I think in terms of, I do agree that it's hard to tell to what degree Israel and the United States at CIA are influencing these protests. There's no doubt that they are because they announced it. And I do think that the timing of it is also interesting. It comes right after the strike on Venezuela, where the Israel lobby announced immediately after, including on Fox News, where a guest said, this regime change in Venezuela is great for Israel, and then stopped himself because he realized he said it out loud. Um, so that messaging has been in the air, and they've broadcast, uh, I'd say, the game plan openly. Uh, in terms of like them having the ability, them being the Mossad and the CIA, having the ability to actually foster or astroturf regime change campaigns in foreign governments. That is what they do for a living. Just they do color revolutions in foreign governments all the time. We did them throughout Eastern Europe in the early 2000s with the Orange Revolution, for example, or the Rose Revolution. All those color revolutions. Even you could say part of the Arab Spring in the Middle East in 2011. Through Facebook and different social media sites, and of course in Iran right now, we've somehow gotten Starlink into the country. That was some sort of operation, obviously, to get uh, that internet access into the country and broadcast, uh, different X feeds into that country that showed, like for instance, like the old Iranian flag, representing the monarchy rather than the current IRGC. So I think there's a lot of that going on, and it is hard to tell how influential it is, but it is there. And I would just say that the CIA and Mossad do know how to do that thing, because do know how to do those sorts of regime change operations, because they've done them countless times in the past.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a little bit of a stretch to say that the Israeli and American governments have announced that they're influencing these things. Like, okay, Mike Pompeo, the biggest statement was from Pompeo, who's a former CIA director and former Secretary of State. Um, I don't know why the heck he said what he said. Like, even if it's true that there are Mossad agents among the protesters, that is such a mind-numbingly stupid thing for him to say, because even from his perspective, right? Like, because it totally delegitimizes the protesters in the eyes of, and it also kind of freaks out the maybe his idea was to freak out the Islamic Republic so that it goes after the protesters more harshly, especially because Trump has threatened to attack Iran if it violently puts down these protests. To me, the most interesting thing about this is like the delicate nature of like Trump's threats, and like he threatened to do this presumably because he wanted the Iranian government to feel restrained. Like, it's like an X factor. It's like something new that's not present in previous protests. It kind of ties the government's hands. Now that they have cracked down, we've seen a little bit of backtracking from him. He was saying, well, a lot of these protesters, they died in stampedes. That's what Trump said. I don't think that's true. I think the protesters who died, it wasn't necessarily the case that the security forces just like wantonly and indiscriminately killed them. And in a lot of these cases, it seems like there's a chaotic situation going on with kind of violence on both sides. But I imagine in other situations, there is a lot of just wanton violence from the security services as they're trying to put down these threatening protests. And then now it's like, I don't, Joseph was kind of alluding to this, but I don't know what the US would strike exactly, right? Like, okay, if you strike the nuclear facilities again, well, first of all, you already said you obliterated them. Secondly, how does that help the protesters? If you do some symbolic strikes, like, it might have the opposite effect of the one that you would want or that the Trump administration would want. It would make the protesters seem like they're on the side of, like, the American empire. And even these protesters, they're not necessarily pro-American, you know? Um, and then if you did something like really targeting the government, um, the paramilitary, the security forces, like, that could just create a total catastrophe. And it's also interesting because it's like, maybe you just want these protests to play out on top of the government, or and I think what Israel clearly wants the US to do something, right? Um, and and so I've seen a lot of messaging in Israeli media that's saying, "Oh, these protests are not going to topple the government." I think they want to present it as like the government will only fall if America gives it one last little push. You know what I mean? Um, but my impression, could be wrong, is that the protests are kind of slightly dying down a little bit. Um, but we'll see going forward. Do either of you want to have the last word before we move on?
I would just say that, I mean, you said it was only Mike Pompeo. It was actually the Mossad account in Farsi too that said directly, "We are with you on the streets. We're there." Uh, so it was announced, at least by Mossad, and I say by extension the CIA because, as you know, John Ratcliffe runs the CIA. He's one of the largest APAC donors, or he was when he was in Congress. And even someone like Steve Bannon says that, or I guess jokingly calls him like a Mossad spy, meaning that he just slavishly is devoted to serving Israel. And we know that too from the Iran strikes when, as the Gray Zone reported from Max Blumenthal, he was feeding Trump cooked up Mossad intelligence about Iran's non existent nuclear weapons program.
True, but if I were Mossad, even if I weren't there, I would want to say that was just to foster paranoia in the regime.
I don't know if I would want to. I take your point, but it seems to just make it easier for the government of Iran to delegitimize the protests.
It,
You know,
it
like,
depends on what you it depends on what you want and what you think the protests are capable of accomplishing, certainly. Um, but I think that there are plenty of reasons that, as an intelligence agency, I would say, oh yeah, we're there with the protesters, even if you
yeah,
totally weren't.
yeah. Okay, I think we'll have to leave it there. I mean, as I said, we'll just skip Greenland. Trump had been talking about taking over Greenland early in the administration. That had died down. Now it's back ever since the Venezuela operation. I'll say, he's saying we're either going to do this the easy way or the hard way. Greenland is owned by Denmark, but it's kind of like semi-autonomous in terms of its governance. It's got, I think, 57,000 people live in Greenland. We have a basing arrangement with Denmark where we could put military bases all over Greenland if we want to. But Trump is saying that we need ownership. He said for psychological reasons, like it just feels better if you own it. You have that security going forward that you're going to have control over it. He's worried about China and especially Russia. I mean, if you look at a map, at a globe at least, you can see Russia is close to Greenland. Um, European sources, diplomatic sources I've talked to, they range from just total, like, they're just incredulous, like, they're baffled, to, like, they're panicking. Like, Europe is panicking. They're saying this would destroy NATO if Trump did some kind of coercive or regressive act to take over Greenland against the wishes of Denmark. But I think Danish and US officials are gonna be talking this week. We often do picks of the week at the end of the episode. Let's do something a little different where we each highlight our own published work on the website. Joseph, what did you publish since your last appearance on Tech Right Now that you want to highlight?
Sure. Uh, for my column last week, I talked about the Venezuela operation and sort of the position that the Venezuelan opposition finds it in. So if you are interested in that, go ahead and read Machado's Failed Gambit.
Yeah, great piece. I also wrote about Venezuela after Venezuela, realism and restraint part ways. If you're interested in, you know, American conservative views on foreign policy, you probably heard of realism and restraint. And one thing that I notice is a lot of realists, like conservative realists, pro-Trump realists, they were in favor of this operation. They said it was very limited and successful and accomplished its goals, and it's not something that we should object to. Whereas a lot of restrainers were highly critical, like unequivocal opposition to the operation. So I interviewed some people, got some quotes, and just did a reported piece on kind of the reaction on the right to Venezuela operation. So after Venezuela, realism and restraint part ways. Harry, what do you want to highlight?
Yeah, so I did an interview this past week with James Fishback, who is running for governor, or he's running for the Republican nomination against Byron Donalds and I think a couple other candidates uh, to be the next Florida governor. And it was an interesting interview. You know, he's definitely taking intentionally, I think, kind of viral positions. So obviously, American first or America first politics and policies, very anti-Israel. Florida has a very bizarre close relationship with Israel, where they just give that foreign government hundreds of millions of dollars every year at this point, and enact all sorts of censorious anti-BDS laws and other restrictions on free speech in the name of that foreign government. And so it was interesting to talk to him about that. I will say there was some criticism of the interview, or at least of a clip that was put out of it. It was obvious from those criticisms that the people actually didn't watch the interview. So I'd urge people to watch the full thing. It's 20 minutes long. You'll see me challenge him on his immigration views, his consistency on, or at least I'd say his flexibility on free speech issues, which he claims are very core to just his beliefs. Um, and so we discussed that. And I also asked about some of the rhetoric, I would say, that he's been using lately that has gotten a lot of criticism for alienating, I would say, different races of people. So last week it was Indian Americans, and I'd say this week it's probably Black Americans. And so there was, some challenging questions in that interview, and I'd say to the critics, watch it.
Yeah, his latest thing is to call Byron Daniels, his opponent, Byron.
Yeah, it's just, what's the point of that?
Yeah, that's one thing that's been interesting to me about Fishback's campaign is it's like super viral and online. And that seems like not the best way to win a gubernatorial election in Florida, which is like full of old people, you know. But okay, so that brings us to the end of our conversation, but not the episode. We're going to go now to Harry's interview of William Hartung of the Quincy Institute about his new co-authored book.
Thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate you being here. When it comes to the military industrial complex, it's hard to think of anyone else in the field who knows more about it than you, or has been studying it closer than you. I mean, you can go back 20 years. You have articles in Forbes writing about all the same stuff. Pentagon arms contractor executives and their pay coming directly from U.S. taxpayers. So you've been on the case for a very long time, and it's just great to be able to speak to you once again.
Well, thanks. I wish I didn't have to study it. There's more to study as time goes on,
Let me talk to you about, or start with this, because you have a new book. It's called The Trillion Dollar War Machine, that you wrote with your co-author, Ben Freeman. It's excellent. We have a review of it written on the American Conservative website that we hope everyone will check out. We hope everyone will also read the book. Um, I want to ask you first about this, which is that there's been a lot of discussion, at least in the past 5 or 6 years since Trump got into office, over this term, the deep state. And when people talk about the deep state, what they're really talking about are these unelected officials, these elites who operate behind the scenes, often in secret, very far away from the public, to conduct their own foreign policy that's separate from what was democratically decided. It seems like if someone wants to claim that they're an opponent of the deep state, it's really impossible to do so without talking about the military industrial complex, which more than any institution really does seem to embody the kind of secret dealings and undemocratic behavior that Americans have grown to resent in Washington. Do you see the military industrial complex as part of a deep state? Is that a fair way to categorize it?
Yeah, I think there's certainly an element of that, along with the intelligence agencies, because sometimes they will kind of reverse things that Congress has approved by manipulating the regulations that are put into force. A lot of the decisions are behind closed doors. Companies that have a stake in certain kind of technology are put on government commissions to assess it, but then they bridge over into the public sphere in terms of their funding think tanks and their PR and also their interactions with members of Congress. So it's sort of like they've got this behind the scenes role, but they're also lobbying very publicly and sometimes unapologetically.
The reason I think analogies or the phrase deep state is appropriate for the military industrial complex is because, when right wingers, for instance, talk about a deep state, what they're talking about is, lobbyists and national security state apparatchiks who are pursuing what they call globalist interests, that they're conducting foreign policy not out of the best interest of the nation state, but out of their own maybe personal profit-making interests, what the left would critique very similarly as pursuing the interest of global capital. They share that critique. Um, One of the things that readers discover from this book is that many of the arms lobbyists that we have in Washington are simultaneously lobbyists for foreign governments like Egypt and Israel and Saudi Arabia. Can you explain why that is?
Yeah, well, especially the authoritarian regimes have common interests with the arms companies. They want their weapons. Sometimes they use them almost like as display items, as the Saudis used to, but often they use them in direct repression of their own people or neighboring countries. So sometimes that's a heavy lift in Washington if a member raises human rights or security concerns. So if you've got a lobbyist who's paid by Saudi Arabia and Lockheed Martin going in and pushing for you. It's kind of a double whammy. There's a guy, Buck McKeon, who used to head the House Armed Services Committee. For a while, he was working for both of those interests. And sometimes the foreign governments like UAE or Saudi spend as much or more on lobbying than people in the weapons industry. So it's kind of a 1-2 punch. And of course, that even doesn't look into the Saudis spending money in other sectors to get influence. But the arms sector is probably primary.
Now, whenever Congress allocates more taxpayer funds for its various wars, Americans are constantly told that actually the money's coming back to us. They call it now the defense industrial base. That's the term that they've come up with. It's very fancy. And it's very effective as a propaganda term, too, because people believe it, especially when these funds are going to arm the genocide in Gaza, but also the Ukraine proxy war. This is all that we hear, that we're funding the defense industrial base. Don't worry about how your taxpayer dollars are being spent. Is there any truth to those arguments?
Well, I mean, it is a good deal for the companies. I mean, a lot of the aid to Israel is to buy U.S. weapons. So there is kind of this cycle where it comes back to Lockheed Martin. But them getting money to support genocide, how beneficial is it? First of all, just in terms of a moral stance in the world, reputational stance, to me, no amount of money really justifies what's happening there. But even on the money front, if Lockheed Martin gets it, some of it's going for $20 million fees for their executives, some of it's going to lobby Congress. It's the least effective way to create jobs in the country. So if you could break out of that cycle where arming wars is considered an important part of our economy, there's plenty of other things we could do. And a tax cut would create more jobs, various infrastructure investments, pretty much you name it. So it's sort of that we pay a high price for whatever money comes back to those companies in terms of blocking our options to do other things, and we certainly have other needs.
I want to ask specifically about Lockheed Martin because you're kind of an expert on it. You've written a separate book on this one company. And historically, it's really been a core part of our national security state. It's exerted a lot of influence and directed U.S. foreign policy. And I can give an example. There's Bruce Jackson, who was the vice president of Lockheed Martin in the 1990s. And aside from being the vice president of that arms company, he was simultaneously the leader and founder of the Committee to Expand NATO, which pushed for all these arms sales to Eastern European countries mainly. Um, and I think it's safe to say at this point, what a terrible idea expanding NATO has been for U.S. foreign policy. It's people like George Kennan or John Mearsheimer, or so many others warned it would be. And what's kind of amazing is that these arms companies lobby in such an open way for their foreign policy goals. Having an arms executive basically chairing the committee whose main purpose is for NATO expansion. But reading your book, it becomes clear that that type of arrangement in Washington is pretty typical. Can you explain how that works?
Yes. Well, Bruce Jackson was interesting because he was at Lockheed Martin, but he was also running the Committee to Expand NATO. And then the head of the company at that time, Norm Augustine, did a tour of East and Central Europe about how if NATO expanded, they could get U.S. weapons, and some of that would go to, companies in the region. So it's kind of a one-two punch. Jackson also was heavily involved in the committee with Wolfowitz and others that pushed for War of the Rock, the project for the New American Century. So he was very much out there in terms of some of the most aggressive and misguided decisions we've made in foreign policy in the last many decades. And of course, it did directly benefit his company. If you asked him, he said, "Oh, I'm just a citizen interested in foreign policy, and we need to help our East European allies." He even tried to recruit a lot of them to support the U.S. war in Iraq, telling them that would improve their chances to get into NATO. So it was fairly blatant, but I think the NATO expansion thing has the advantage of being cloaked in anti-Russian rhetoric, and that often clouds the argument. The profiteering goes on under the guise of these larger, often issues where they're demonizing an adversary that certainly is not a model of anything, but is not a direct threat to the United States. So it's yeah, it's kind of extraordinary when somebody like Jackson could do what he did.
One of the best sellers, you could say, for Lockheed Martin is its F-35 program, which I would say you shred to pieces, you and Ben Friedman, in your book. This is a program that costs 12 to 13 billion dollars a year, and it doesn't even work. We have not used any of these planes in any of our military operations for a myriad of reasons that you talk about. Can you explain why that is, and why it is that Americans continue to, cough up the dollars every year for this program on a plane that doesn't work?
Yeah, it's a good example because when they developed it, they said it was going to be a revolution in military procurement, cheaper than anything that came before, having the most advanced electronics. It sounds a lot like the sales pitch that Silicon Valley is making for the things they're trying to foist on us. And one of the problems was it was supposed to do three different things. It was supposed to work for the Air Force, the Navy, and the Marines. So it had to land on a carrier. Version was supposed to be go up vertically, almost like a helicopter, and take off. It was supposed to win dogfights in the air, support troops on the ground, be a bomber. And it did none of them well. And part of that was Lockheed Martin's mismanagement. Part of it was a flawed design. And so now they often can't be in the air more than half the time. They're not particularly good against other aircraft. There's better ways to support troops on the ground. And they're lighter than other aircraft because of the stealth concern. So they can't carry as many bombs. And I mean, Israel has used it in Gaza, but it's a defenseless adversary. No anti-aircraft, no air force. So it doesn't really prove that it's a wonderful claim. But what they did is or sometimes they call it political engineering. They put factories and components in 46 of the 50 states, and there's a caucus in the House that's just members with pieces of it built in their states who sometimes put more in the budget than the Pentagon asked for. And then they sold it to Europeans on the basis of, hey, if you want us to be the leading force in NATO, you got to buy our stuff. We have to be able to operate together. And so that is an extra hook for them to say, well, we can't disappoint our allies, can we? So it's really it's kind of a political jet. and we're being foisted with it. And even some members who have said we're pouring money on a rat hole say it's too late. We've invested so much and so forth. There may be a threat going forward if they move all in on things like swarms of drones, but too often the Pentagon will just do both. They'll keep buying the F-35 and they'll buy drones. The new fighter plane is supposed to have these unpiloted wingmen to go with the plane itself. So Boeing, which has a terrible record in its weapons programs for the last decade, is building the plane. And then a tech company like Anduril might build the side piece, or in Golden Dome, the old companies make the hardware, the new companies make the software. So basically, what was being billed as a competition between these upstart companies and the old guard, they're paying off both, and to some degree, they're cooperating rather than competing.
Let me ask you about nuclear policy, which frankly I didn't know a lot about before reading your book, but you learned a lot about it from reading The Trillion-Dollar War Industry. And one of the things that I was surprised to learn is how much of our nuclear triad is just unnecessary, it seems. I mean, you cite Norman Solomon and Defense Secretary or former Defense Secretary William Perry and Daniel Ellsberg, among other experts on nuclear weapons, who say as much, that it's not a reliable deterrent and actually quite dangerous for the United States to have them. Can you explain a bit more about that? And what are the incentives that are in place for us to keep building these nuclear weapons? And as the Pentagon announced recently, to modernize completely our nuclear arsenal?
Well, the thing about the ICBM is there's a very short window if there's a threat of an attack for the president to decide whether to launch them, a matter of some minutes or 10 or 15 minutes max. And so if they're not sure and they have to launch them, if it's a false alarm, we've already started a nuclear war. So they're unstable in that sense. But also, when they were first built, submarine launched missiles were somewhat primitive. Now they're accurate. You can't find the submarines. They have bombers. They don't need three different ways to deliver nuclear weapons. And we're safer with fewer and at least some guardrails, which are now going away. All the major treaties have been shredded between the U.S. and Russia. So we're in a dangerous moment. And the last thing you want is a hair trigger weapon in the midst of all these tensions. But there's a Senate ICBM coalition, which is members from states that either have ICM bases or are building parts of the new system. And they're relatively small states. It's Wyoming, Montana, North Dakota, Utah. But often the senators will say, well, to the parties, well, you don't want to lose the seat, do you? So, if you do this, the other party is going to win the seat. Or they'll claim the jobs issue, which, at a hyper local level, sure. I mean, if it's a small place and you're pouring in all this money, but it comes at the expense of other things, including, I mean, if you're not, some sort of peacenik or want to reduce the Pentagon budget, even if you just wanted to change the mix, more conventional arms, different kinds of systems, more reliable, there's this huge piece of the budget going into these systems. And they had such a cost overrun for the current new one that it was reviewed by the Pentagon whether to cancel it altogether. And they said, oh, it's too important, and they're going to go full speed ahead. So a lot of it's, again, this lobbying. And it goes back to some degree to the 50s. There was a competition under Eisenhower because nuclear weapons were a big part of the budget. Every service wanted a piece of it. And finally, the Navy came up with putting them on submarines, whereas the Air Force controlled the bombers and the ICBMs. And they actually, each service came up with its own doctrine that argued that its weapon was better. The Navy said, well, ours are less accurate, but they can take out populations. There'll be deterrence. Air Force said, we can take out weapons. And they even sent their people around propagandizing for their particular kind of weapon. And of course, there was the push for Eisenhower to build a bomber, which he didn't think was needed. There was the ginned up thing about the missile gap, which ended up not being a gap. So there's all this pressure on Eisenhower coming from the companies and the military. And finally, they solved it, as they often do, by funding both. So they funded the Navy for ICBMs and the Air Force for the Air Force for ICBMs, Navy for sublaunch. And for a while, the Army had, nuclear armed artillery. So everybody was getting their piece of the pie. But this bureaucratic infighting became transformed into almost like a religious commitment that this was the only strategy that we could pursue. and people often didn't really say it until they were out of government, even though they knew it. Even James Mattis made many harsh statements about whether we needed them until he came into the Trump administration, and suddenly he changed his tune. So it's kind of just how out of whack the system is that really, some senators from a relatively small state and kind of a misleading kind of strategic vision that came out of an economic concern can persist for this long.
Let me ask you another question about a different chapter in your book. It's about DC's think tanks because at the Quincy Institute, you guys have created this excellent tool called the Think Tank Funders Tracker. I believe you did it with Nick Cleveland Stout, and it reveals funding from all sorts of foreign governments and arms companies across nearly every major or frequently cited think tank in DC. With the exception of various mysteriously even dark funded groups like the so-called Foundation for Defense of Democracies, where no one knows where they get their money at all. You've discovered a lot. Can you talk about some of your findings?
Yeah, and really, Ben Freeman it took the lead along with Nick. But basically, I think it corrupts the debate in a number of ways. Sometimes it's more subconscious, like, well, gee, if I write this, is it going to irritate my funder? Sometimes funders have intervened directly. They run the studies by them. They say we don't like this, or they fund a study. Could you reinterpret this treaty so we can get sold long-range drones? One of them got $20 million from the UAE and then turned around, tried to whitewash its role in Yemen. So it's it corrupts their findings, but it also it puts the positions of the companies out there at one remove. So instead of the head of Lockheed Martin saying, "Yeah, let's go to war," which doesn't it's not a good look. You've got these people who are supposed to be objective experts pushing the same line, and it's not only that they're experts in the media, but they often testify on the Hill without acknowledging that their institution is floated by foreign money and the contractors. So I think Ben really he exposed it on a much greater level, and it's undoubtedly conservative because some of the companies are not revealing the sources. And I've had this experience. There was a journalist who was going to write a piece about, are there any think tanks that don't take money from the contractors? There were maybe one or two, and his boss killed the story. Says, "Oh, everybody knows these think tanks get money from contractors." It's not news, but it would have been news to most Americans. So it was the kind of inside Washington, cynical view of things.
So I would say that your book with Ben Freeman focuses a lot on these five major companies that really control this monopoly or oligopoly on Pentagon contracts, and they've consolidated starting in the 1990s until today to the point where they now dominate. But you also take aim at new emerging defense companies, really defense tech companies in Silicon Valley, chiefly Palantir and Anduril. What do you see as the main threats posed by those two companies to Americans?
Yeah, I think it's twofold. I mean, the one thing that is true is that the old companies are they're slow. There's cost overruns. The things they produce are not that effective, and they have this huge lobbying arm. They actually one of the companies did a thing called Arsenal of Democracy 2.0. There's pretty good critique of how the old companies work, but the problem is the new companies are selling technology that doesn't exist yet and claiming it's going to give this miracle advantage to the United States, which has never happened before. I mean, Vietnam, they were going to have a electronic battlefield that would, recognize every single Viet Cong in the jungle. And they found simple countermeasures. They had to junk the whole thing. Reagan's impenetrable Star Wars shield never came to be. And, they had this revolution in military affairs where we were going to have precision guided munitions, superior communications. That was not relevant to winning a conflict in Iraq or Afghanistan. So, but yet they're coming back with the same argument. If we dominate AI coordinated weapons, we will have a permanent advantage against China. When in fact, the best that will happen is an arms race. And also because they feel the key in warfare is what they call shortening the kill chain, time between you see the target and you kill it. That will put a bias towards taking humans out of the loop. even though they say they aren't planning to do that at the moment. So you've got the technical risk, and then you've got the ideologies of these folks who are extreme anti-government folks. They think they can do everything themselves. They want to get rid of all kinds of regulations, including like independent testing, things to reduce price gouging. And then they have these ambitions. Palmer Luckey goes on TV and says, "Oh yeah, we're going to have a war with China. We're going to bury them. We're going to have ammunition 8 years into the war." Now, who would think there would be an 8-year war with a nuclear power? But he has no foreign policy experience. He was a gamer who decided to make weapons. Peter Thiel wants to live forever. Musk wants to colonize space. So, in addition to the danger of the technology, you've got these people who almost feel like they're a superior set of beings and should be in charge of our budget, our foreign policy, and the way we live our lives. And so, I think it's that double threat. I mean, the head of Lockheed Martin would quietly say to his investors, "Yeah, there's turbulence around the world that will benefit." These guys are shouting it from the rooftops, which is why they've got a kind of a personality connection with Trump, but also he's giving away the store, not just on that, but other things that they want. And of course, JD Vance was trained by Peter Thiel, financed by Peter Thiel, and they've got people all over the government. And it is, it's seductive. Well, gee, if we could just win through superior technology, wouldn't that be great? I mean, we have to negotiate with these, problematic countries. This dominance would benefit us in other ways. But, they're selling kind of a bill of goods that is never going to come to be at great cost and probably increasing the risk of conflict.
Yeah, it's interesting because the claim of a program like Doge was to cut exactly this sort of waste, fraud, and abuse, but that never happened in any significant ways. And now where it mattered, at least, because the Pentagon wasn't touched at all, nor its military contractors. And instead of cuts to the Pentagon, what we got instead was $1 trillion Pentagon budget, the largest ever. Um, why is that?
Well, it's interesting because when we started the book, we thought that was going to happen a few years from now. So it's come at an accelerated pace. But I think it's because the system's so broken that Congress can't even debate substance. I mean, they had a hearing about this commission report that called for this all-out nuclear buildup, back to sort of Cold War uh, approaches. And in the hearing, in the Senate Armed Services Committee, most of the members didn't question the rationale, the doctrine. Was it making us safer? They said, well, I have a missile in my state that can intercept hypersonic missiles. Would you agree we should buy more? Or we need to spruce up the Nevada test site? And finally, Senator Warren said, what's this going to cost? And the co-chairs said, well, cost is no object. I mean, we just need these things. And the thing is, the co-chair of that commission, John Kyle, was not only a lifelong opponent of arms control when he was in the Senate, but had been a lobbyist for Northrop Grumman, which makes the new nuclear bomb or the new ICBM. Nobody asked him about that. None of the coverage even mentioned that. It was just taken for granted. So you've got this little bubble where the money and influence and kind of outmoded concepts get in the way of having a discussion. And I think if you had a discussion between people who are hardliners, reformers, for restraint, if it was an open discussion that was substantive, we'd have a better policy than we have now.
I have one final question before I let you go, and it's not necessarily about the book, but it does have to do with some reporting that we've done at the American Conservative, but also Dropside News has done as well about really one of the most talked about people last year, Jeffrey Epstein. And it was revealed in various reporting that Jeffrey Epstein was basically an arms broker, selling security contracts on behalf of Israel to West African countries, but also trying to negotiate different geopolitical deals on behalf of that foreign government. And there's extensive evidence that Jeffrey Epstein was in close proximity with various arms dealers involved in both the Iran-Contra deal and also the Al Yamama deal from the 1980s that involved Saudi Arabia, specifically Adnan Khashoggi and Douglas Lease, who Jeffrey Epstein actually became the godfather of Douglas Lease's grandchildren. That's how close they were. Knowing what you do about the arms industry and the corruption involved, maybe some of the shady dealings that occur at an international level, would it make sense, or or what are your impressions of that reporting and maybe the role that Jeffrey Epstein played based on what you know about how the arms industry operates?
Uh, yeah, I haven't done a deep dive, but there's that whole sector of folks who's make their money as brokers, and so they have to make the connections with the foreign officials. They have to close the deal, and when it's illicit, like Iran Contra, they're even more needed. But somebody like Epstein, given all his contacts, his kind of ability to influence or affect influential people, it would be a natural extension of the kind of thing he does. I mean, the fact that it was unknown for so long is the other aspect of this system. They're kind of operating in the shadows. And, you had Khashoggi, um, Victor Bout, who was on the Ukrainian Russian side, did all kinds of horrific things at the end of the Cold War. They took the stockpiles in Southern Africa and Eastern Europe, funneled them to African countries that were committing genocide, and they gave governments kind of a one remove because they were selling, in some cases, weapons that already existed. But the governments stood back. They didn't have a system to prosecute them for the most part. So it's just, given all the other things he did, if he was also being an arms broker, it's kind of a piece because there are these illicit kind of activities that influential people are aware of but are trying to keep hidden. So he was certainly well positioned to do that kind of thing. I'm surprised that his role didn't come out sooner, but I think it's a logical combination.
And I raised the point of the Ali Yamama deal too, because that one was notoriously corrupt in the sense that it's still being investigated, or was just a few years ago, for various bribes and payoffs associated with it. Um, I'm wondering what you could, maybe you could shine some light on the sort of dealings that arms companies and arms dealers do, kind of beyond their own governments in that sort of way, completely off the books. Lockheed Martin, for instance, I think in the 1970s, there was a huge bribery scandal with them, paying bribes to foreign officials for procurement. Can you talk about some of that history and whether or not that may still be ongoing? I mean, one of the things that's discovered in your book is that there's really no attention to any of this at all, whether it's corruption through procurement services, as has been happening in Ukraine famously with drones, that, Mike Pompeo now serves on the board of a drone company there. No one's looking, no one's investigating. Rand Paul, 2 years ago, offered an amendment to audit the aid that we were giving to these foreign wars, to look and see if there's any corruption, and we purposely looked the other way.
Yeah, well, it used to be, foreign bribery was essentially legal. There were no restrictions. I mean, the companies used to take off the cost of middlemen on their taxes. But then after Watergate, Senator Frank Church had a series of hearings about multinational corporations, and Senator William Proxmire, who had done battle with Lockheed on other issues, passed the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. So now there were penalties, but of course they had to be enforced. They've kind of, for the most part, modernized bribery because what they do is something called an offset agreement, where if country A is buying a lot of weaponry from us at a high cost, they want something in return. So the company will say, okay, we'll let you build part of it in your state, or we'll build you something else. We'll build you a hotel complex. We'll help you learn how to start a cybersecurity business. And one of the more bizarre things we came across was when Marilyn Hewson was the head of Lockheed Martin. She gave a speech in the UAE to a group of women, global women parliamentarians, and almost all the speech was about their military cooperation with the UAE, helping them get a space program, helping them on cybersecurity. Now they have a company that's the 22nd largest company in the world, a UAE company. But once you've got those big deals, the government doesn't really regulate them almost at all. So if you're doing that, it's easy enough to put some relative of the president on the payroll or create a bogus company or so forth. So instead of bags of cash, it's now these big impenetrable deals where there's any kind of all manner of opportunities for corruption, and so it's harder to penetrate, especially since government sort of said, "Oh, well, that's their business, that's marketing," but of course it can do huge damage. So there's still the old school. I mean, uh, Robert Menendez getting gold bars and trying to help Egypt. I think that was just stupidity. I mean, he could have done it differently. But anyway, so there's this new challenge. If they're going to do these deals, they should be transparent, which means the companies can't just go off and do whatever they want. But in some cases, it serves the purpose of government. I mean, Saudi Arabia should be a pariah state, but they have oil. They spend money on behalf of U.S. covert operations. Some people just throw up their hands and say, well, MBS is going to be running the place. We have to just deal with them. So if these, offset deals are also greasing the wheels, it's serving the interests of many in the elite who want that relationship. So they have no interest in penetrating the aspect of how it can be used for large scale corruption.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate you coming and talking about the book. It's excellent. It is The $1 Trillion War Machine with Ben Freeman, and we hope that everyone buys it soon.
Yeah, and Ben did such a great job. I can't thank him enough. And of course, we have a lot of work to do now. So, thank you.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Thank you.